Hello, my guest today is the Reverend Dr. Rob Whiteman, who is the minister of Dundee Unitarians in Dundee, Scotland. Rob, you have to agree that the world is in a very difficult state now with conflicts among religions, the growing pandemic, race issues throughout the world, and much, much more. How has Unitarianism addressed these issues through their various faith communities in your mind?
I think that's a very broad question, Joe. Interesting. I have to agree. I do agree. I don't think I had to agree. And that's where I could start with for Unitarians. We're people without a creed, and therefore you don't have to agree. It's for
Mm.
people to come to their own conclusions for themselves. But I think most of us would agree that your question is a valid question. And so, how have Unitarians addressed those issues through their faith communities? I think we have, well, as you know, we have a long tradition, we have an ancient tradition of acceptance, tolerance, and freedom. And I think those are important things to take to, particularly the conflicts among religions. We don't have a creed. Uh, we're a community of very much of people who see a spiritual dimension to life and wish to explore that together and see a spiritual dimension and a value in exploring that as a community, in a community, with learning. And so we respect other traditions. So in services that I lead, I often use the Psalms because they're such a wonderful repository of wisdom and understanding of God and perceptions of God. But I would also use sayings by the Buddha and many, obviously the Bible itself. We do come from Christian roots, particularly the Gospels. Well, I should say the New Testament rather than the Bible, because obviously the Hebrew scriptures are also very important. There's some wonderful bits in there. The book of Job, I think, has a lot to say to us at the moment. In this, coming back to your questions, has a lot to say to us at the moment. But so I think for us, the conflict between religions, we would want to say, but they all have such value, and we're all about. I think for all spiritual communities, about relating to God. I mean, there are some humanist Unitarians, but I think that's actually on the decline. I do think the current pandemic and the current crisis in the world, and we could add environmental issues to your list of points. I think that the religions and the spiritual communities have a particular thing to say into that discussion about the environment, about us being stewards of creation rather than owners of creation. It comes from a deeply religious perspective. So I don't want to, I suppose I've bad-mouthed your question there, and I don't want to at all. It was a very good question, and I think we would address it, all of those, by being open, tolerant, compassionate. I think compassion is a vital part of all religions and how we approach each other. Lao Tzu said that love and compassion are the vital things that we have to take, the great gifts that we have. And so I think we will be part of that tradition and just, respecting traditions, respecting people's opinions, and seeing a value in exploring them together. And if we work together as people of this planet, that has to be a way forward.
Indeed. So put this now in a practical perspective for me. As a minister in the Unitarian Church, how has your ministry changed with these rising tides of things such as racism, anti-Semitism, the declining environment, etc.? How has your ministry changed during the pandemic, for example?
Pandemic has been an incredible challenge for ministry, but oddly an incredible blessing.
Mm.
I suppose that the big change, things have changed fast. Myself, when I was stuck at home, for a while, I just sent out, I sort of did a service and I posted it out to people. A number of my congregation are very elderly, they don't have a computer and that sort of thing. And I emailed it to others who had computers, etc., etc. And then after about 5 or 6 weeks, I became more comfortable with this sort of thing, with Zoom. And I thought, right, I'm going to sit on my sofa and I'm going to do that service. Obviously, I can't do it in a church, but I'm going to do it on Zoom. And luckily, my wife was here to do all the sort of technical stuff, and we did it on Zoom. Then in July, we met again in church. But we had people around the world who were joining us. Members of St. Mark's, Edinburgh, who actually were stuck in France, were joining us. My mother joins us. She lives on the edge of Richmond Park. She will never go to the church in Dundee. She's never seen me lead a service. Suddenly, she was having that opportunity. So she was now saying, well, I want to continue to come. So we have found a way of doing Zoom in the church whilst also having the service in church. It doesn't look like the BBC. You know, we're not, it's just on Zoom. It's just talking heads like this. But we've managed to change our practice to include that. Now, maybe we'd have done that 5 years down the line. We'd have talked about it, and then people would have said, well, I haven't got a computer. Why would we do that? We've had to do it right now to include people, and that's broadened our community. So that has made a big difference to our practice during the pandemic. But wider, how has the environmental crisis, the Black Lives Matter, those sort of things changed my ministry? I think that as a minister, you have to respond. It's vital, certainly in Unitarianism, to respond to what your community is saying. And you hear what matters for them, and you reflect on that. And I suppose it's my role as a minister to be a critical reflector. I am supposedly educated in these areas, and I've studied, but I'm also, I think, their paying me gives me time to go away and sit and reflect, and then come back to them and say, I'm reflecting on these issues that you're bringing up or the world is bringing up, and this is what I'm seeing. Does that chime for you? So I would never sit there and say, you have to do this, you have to do that. But I think certainly within the Unitarian context, there's much more of my thinking and reflecting on our tradition and other people's traditions and the world around us makes me address it in this way. How does that chime with you? And certainly within the Unitarian context, it's perfectly acceptable for somebody to come up to it and say, that doesn't chime with me at all, you're an idiot and you should have looked at this. And I'm very much open to that. If all I got after a service every week was, thank you, Vic, a very nice sermon, and shake your hand, I would feel I hadn't quite got it right somewhere. It's lovely to get that sort of affirmation, but it's also nice for somebody to say, I don't quite agree with you, or what about this and what about that? So I think that's how my ministry is changing, and that as I hear people responding to what's going on around them, and as I myself respond, I try and reflect that to the community, and obviously it's now a slightly wider community through Zoom, and I think that will continue. So that's my response to how it affects my ministry, and I think that would be, I would like to think that's true for all ministers, but I may be wrong.
I think you've described it in a very articulate and I would say indeed eloquent way, that these challenges, these seismic shifts in society have widened and deepened the conversation for those ministers who wish to go there, to use these technologies, to use these opportunities. So you mentioned the woman in Paris who was a member of St. Mark's who joined your service. What if someone is of another faith or no faith and wishes to become a member of the Unitarian faith? What steps are there? For example, in Judaism, we have a course in Edinburgh called Exploring Judaism, because as you know, Jews do not convert others. They have to seek it out on their own, and it's an introductory kind of course. What's the journey for those who wish to learn more about the Unitarian faith?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, Unitarians have written a number of courses. I was involved with the previous, with the minister at St. Mark's, the Reverend Maud Robinson. She and I ran a course called Building Your Own Theology, which was about 5 years ago now, which is often run in Unitarian churches. In terms of becoming a member, obviously there's a sort of formal, once you been coming for 6 months, you can sort of apply to become a member, and that gives you a vote within the community, and you sign a book and that sort of thing. But that's not, I think, at all what you're meaning. I think you're really meaning what does it look like to become a Unitarian? What's that journey? And it's not about signing a piece of paper, and it's not about a legal thing. It's not about voting. And I think, let's go back to my journey, which always is, it's not that talking about me is an interesting thing to do, but I think if you start from the personal, you always get a better perspective in some ways. I walked into the Unitarian Church very much disillusioned with what had been going on for me in the Episcopal Church. I realized that there were some people who were saying one thing, but they weren't acting it out. Their belief wasn't real. And when I went into the Unitarian Church, I found people who weren't saying you have to believe this or I believe this. I found people who were interested in exploring it as a community, who were interested in the spiritual dimension of life, and were prepared to say, we don't have all the answers, but I really want to ask the questions and I want to think about this. And people are interested in doing that. So I think if you want to join the Unitarian community, an open mind is probably the first thing you need, that says, I haven't got the answers, but I really would like to think about what the possible answers might be and what the right answers might be for me. I'm certainly open to the fact that my understanding of God and the spiritual life is different from yours. We've lived very different lives. I don't know what your life has been like, but I'm prepared to bet that it's not been the same as mine. But we also, both of us probably have a very different perspective on God from Job. He lived in a different time, a different place. We've had quite a comfortable life, certainly compared to some sort of pastoralist living in the Middle East at that time would have been a much harder life. And earlier on, we were hearing about people in Rwanda and the importance of education there. I've been in Zimbabwe at times, and I've seen people living in the shanty. I went into a shanty town on the edge of Chitungwiza near Harare. If you're living in that sort of life, where power is a novelty almost, electrical power, and water is very difficult to get hold of, etc., etc., your understanding of God is bound to be different. And therefore, I don't think we can say there's a right answer. And so I'm very much conscious that my perception and my experience of God is different to yours. And I think being open to that is an important part of the Unitarian journey. And I suppose, to some extent, that's why I doubt that Unitarianism will ever take over the world. But as like Judaism, I'm not sure that we're a converting religion in that way. I also don't, and I'm sure you'd agree that it wouldn't suit everybody. Judaism wouldn't suit everybody. Unitarianism wouldn't suit everybody. And I'm not sure that a whole world of Unitarians would work, because we're very much questioning people. But I think we very much bring something to the table, an openness, an inclusiveness, and a campaigningness. We have campaigned for social justice over the years. We campaigned for safe-sex marriages when that wasn't popular. If you go back in America, the Pentagon Papers released during the Vietnam War were done by Unitarians. My predecessor in Dundee, Thomas Fish Palmer, fought for people to be allowed to join unions, and he was sent off to Botany Bay on a boat and never got back. He was released, but he never got back all the way. Another predecessor of mine, Williamson, after which the church with whom I serve is named, fought again for workers' rights, fought for children's education, particularly female education in Dundee between 1860 and 1920. He died in 1925. He fought for workers to be allowed to gather together. These people were fighting for social justice, and that's never going to be something that's completed. And therefore, the job's never going to be done. Not everybody's going to be Unitarians. So I'm rambling around your question, but I think to come back to your question, what sets you on the way to being a Unitarian? An openness of mind, a desire for freedom of thought, and a desire to just wonder what the answers are for you, wonder what God is like, and a desire to explore that in community.
Well, that's very, very interesting because it's also similar to Judaism. As you said earlier, Jewish people do not convert, Unitarians do not convert. In fact, we welcome people who question, are prepared to argue, to debate, etc. But you mentioned just now social justice, and I wonder, could you give me some specific examples of social justice activities your church is involved in Dundee or other Unitarian communities throughout the UK? You mentioned earlier the work the Unitarians contributed to the Pentagon Papers and to same-sex marriage and so on. Are there examples for within the natural environment or within Black Lives Matters where your faith community has been active?
Yes, there are. I'm certainly aware. We have a magazine called The Inquirer. It's the oldest nonconformist magazine going back. And there's been quite a lot of that recently about Extinction Rebellion and individuals going off and getting arrested and this sort of thing. And there's been discussion about whether that's been appropriate and whether breaking the law is appropriate. I have to say that my perspective from being in Zimbabwe and being in the cathedral when the police and the riot police arrived to kick everybody out of the cathedral, being the only white person in the building, has informed my views on that. So again, not answering your question. Again, a discursus, but I will get back to your question. Yes,
Fine.
Unitarians have been involved in social justice, as I was saying. The campaign for same-sex marriage, all the work of Thomas Fish Palmer and Henry Williamson. There was a lot of work in Liverpool in the 19th century, and it's continued on. On the Black Lives Matter, yes, I think a lot of people have been very exercised. We are aware. I think we're a fairly white church. We have made a statement in support from the General Council, and I've certainly been involved in a number of seminars trying to look at inherent privilege and trying to understand that. And so I think we'd be very supportive of Black Lives Matter, simply because we think all, and I know when you say all lives matter, people say, but you've missed the point there. But I think Unitarians make a point of every life has value. And we recognize that there is things, structural injustice has been, and structural racism has been very important, particularly in America. And it's not surprising that this movement has come out of America. And we mustn't just pay lip service to it. I have put together the course for Unitarians, people training for Unitarian ministry in history. And it's done online. And so there are a number of sort of 5-minute talking heads, a bit like this. This is more than 5 minutes. And I've been trying to very much get talking heads on relevant to Black Lives Matter. So there was a chap called Rathbone in Liverpool who very much campaigned against slavery, and Unitarians were very much involved in that movement along with the Quakers and Wilberforce. There were a number of Unitarians involved there. But on the other side, we have a trust fund where a lot of the money came, a chap called Hibbert, who got money from sugar plantations in the West Indies. And therefore, we know that it worked on both sides. You can't just say our great ancestors campaigned against slavery. You have to look at what we're doing now, and we're looking at the prejudices we ourselves carry, where our money comes from, and some of that was derived from slavery. I'm not of the view that you should therefore give it back. Money is a neutral thing, and you can apply it for it's not good or bad money. What you do with it can be good or bad, but it itself is not. It's a neutral substance. It's a form of barter. Therefore, I think it's very important you then say, well, this is maybe where the money came from, but how should we apply it for the best value now? And so I think Unitarians would take an ongoing emerging view of social justice. Just today, I know there are a number of people very much concerned about the provision of school meals for children, and you'll have seen that in the paper today. And I know this is going to go for longer, so I don't want to focus on a today topic. But social justice, Unitarians are very much involved. My congregation itself is very small. It's something we would like to do more of. We don't have the capacity with 10 people, of whom I'm by far, well, I what used to be by far the youngest. A couple of newer people have joined recently. But we do support the local food bank, and we've been in touch with them several times during the lockdown to say, can we send you money and that sort of thing, because we realized it was particularly important. So I think for Unitarians, social justice is important. We realize, my congregation, I think, realized its limitations with relation to social justice. Across the whole Unitarian denomination, it would be a driver, because I think, as I probably hinted, faith has to be practical. So what you believe, you have to act out. If you just say, we believe this and we keep it sacred and special, that's pointless. You actually have to do something with your faith. It has to affect the way you live, or it's meaningless. And that, I think, would be a very central thing for Unitarians, as it would for many other faiths.
Well, what I hear you saying, and it's been obvious through the work of your predecessor and Williamson and others, that when it comes to social justice, you won't find Unitarians at the back of the queue. They're usually on the front lines, which is something very commendable. I want to just conclude today by looking into the crystal ball and asking you, what do you believe is the future of Unitarianism and faith in general? And linked to that, how will your services, your worship change and evolve to maintain its relevance? You mentioned in the earlier interview how during your flower ministry, you have adapted that service during the age of the pandemic. So how do you think services, worship will change to maintain its relevance? And what might just be the future of Unitarianism and faith in general?
To start with our worship, when I plan a service, I start with a blank sheet of paper. There's no liturgy, there's no requirements, and so our worship can evolve every single week. And certainly my congregation, I think, value the fact that they don't know what's going to come this week, because the shape may change. Some week it's just a meditation, other weeks it may look more like a hymn sandwich, and I vary it around. So at the moment, during the pandemic, we're having shorter services. They're only half an hour in the building because we feel we can't use the toilet safely. And for the elderly people, more than half an hour is too big a risk. And therefore we're saying, okay, we're just going to do half an hour. That changes the shape. We don't sing. People have long called Unitarians Quakers with hymns. We love singing. And Welsh Unitarianism has a huge singing tradition. A lot of the great Welsh tunes come from Unitarianism. And so we've had to change in that way. And I have no doubt that we will change again, and we will change again, and we will change again in response to what we see as a situation. Now, the other question you're really asking is, how do I think people respond to that continual changing? Because we can change so quickly, hopefully we can be very responsive. Some people argue that religion's now irrelevant, and a lot of churches are losing in numbers. Certainly the big churches, Church of Scotland is going down very, very quickly. I don't know how liberal Judaism is doing. I suspect it's doing much as it's always done, and will just go up and down and this sort of thing. In terms of the general societal trends, I actually think that the pandemic has, a lot of people have sat down and looked at the big questions, because they've had to step back from their consumerism. And I think people have looked at the big questions. So I think there are more people engaging with spiritual matters. Some of them will engage through Extinction Rebellion. Some of them engage through formal religion. Some of them, they will engage in different ways. If we ever get back to the old commuting every day, sandwiches at the desk, that sort of working style, maybe people's time will contract and that will go out. But I think for a lot of people, the questions of the pandemic, the questions in the environment, the questions of interreligious conflict, the questions of Black Lives Matter, the questions of how do we feed ourselves, ask deeper spiritual questions. And so I think religion is not going to disappear, because people will always ask those spiritual questions. And the original part of the pandemic, with people dying, a lot of people suddenly had to face, well, what if I catch this? What if I die? And that's a very sharp question for a lot of people when you meet it. And that's, for me, I suppose, one of the reasons why taking funerals is perhaps more rewarding than taking weddings, because people come much closer to those really deep spiritual questions, and they ask themselves those questions, and not just people who are about to die or you're sitting with in the process of dying who you then take a funeral for, but those people who are shaping up to grief. It asks them big questions, and a lot of people have shaped up to grief in this pandemic, and they're going to feel there's going to be wider grief about the environment and about Black Lives Matter, and George Floyd, his death raised questions for people. And so I think a lot of what's going on is going to make spirituality more important to people rather than less important. And Unitarianism will be one answer that people have for that. Other faiths will offer other answers, and different answers will suit different people. But I'm not pessimistic about the future of Unitarianism. I think we have something to offer, and it's up to people like myself, as a minister employed by congregation, but also just general Unitarians. Not just ministers lead services, anyone can lead services. And so we have an inclusive way in that. I'm not set apart or ordained. I'm just called to lead the community in that way. So I think that we have something to offer, and I'm sure that all faiths have something to offer as we go forward.
And I agree. Rob, you have been so generous with your time today. And I think one of the reasons that the Unitarian community will expand and will grow is because of thoughtful, thinking men and women such as yourself, who, as you say, are supported by communities and given the time to think, to read, to study, as our rabbis. You mentioned wondering if the liberal Jewish sect is growing, and in fact it is, more so than the others, because it has less doctrine, it has more of an open door. And as I look behind you at the open door in your office there at St. Andrews, I'm reminded that is one of the best definitions of Unitarianism, that the door is open, that you invite individuals to bring their personal experience, just as you've shared today, and make it part of the collective whole in terms of forming values as a community. So on behalf of the Edinburgh Interfaith Association, thank you for letting us put this spotlight on faith regarding Unitarians in Scotland. And for those of you who are interested in exploring the Unitarian faith community, you'll find links on our website. But for now, Reverend Dr. Rob Whiteman, thank you very much.
Joe, thank you very much. And I hope we meet again, hopefully even in St. Mark's.
Indeed.